The morning sun hadn't fully risen yet, but the airport was already buzzing like a beehive. Travelers hurried in every direction, rolling suitcases, checking phones, balancing coffee cups, and calling out last-minute instructions to their kids. Among them walked two 10-year-old girls hand in hand, dressed in matching sky-blue dresses with white collars and little navy backpacks slung over their shoulders. Their steps were light, their eyes wide with excitement. This wasn't just any trip. It was their first time flying alone, and they were headed across the ocean to see their grandmother, who they hadn't hugged in over a year. A gentle woman in her 50s walked just behind them, keeping a calm but watchful eye. She wasn't their mother, she was their nanny, the one who'd tucked them in at night since they were toddlers, who knew how Zoe liked her toast barely browned, and how Maya always needed 2 bedtime stories, never just one. Today she carried their documents in a neat folder: passports, boarding passes, a signed letter from their father giving permission for the trip, and a note for the airline crew with emergency contacts and special instructions. Everything was in order. Everything had been double-checked. They reached the gate for their flight, Skyward Airways Flight 217, non-stop to London. The girls' faces lit up when they saw the sleek silver plane waiting on the tarmac. "That's ours?" Zoe whispered, tugging her sister's sleeve. Maya nodded, bouncing slightly on her toes. They'd flown before, but always with their dad or nanny in the same cabin. This time they'd been promised something special. Real first-class seats just like grown-ups. Their father had arranged it as a little celebration. They'd both made the honor roll at school and he wanted them to feel proud. The boarding process began smoothly. Business class passengers went first, then those needing extra time. When their group was called, the nanny handed over the boarding passes to the gate agent, who scanned them without a second glance. "First class, seats 1A and 1B, she said with a smile. "Have a wonderful flight." But as the girls stepped onto the jet bridge, the narrow corridor connecting the terminal to the plane, they were met by a woman in a crisp navy uniform, her hair pulled back tightly, name tag gleaming under the fluorescent lights. She held a clipboard and wore an expression that said she'd seen it all and wasn't impressed. "Hold on," the flight attendant said, stepping in front of them. Her voice wasn't unkind, but it was firm, like a teacher stopping a student from running in the hallway. "These children can't go into first class," the nanny blinked. "I'm sorry?" "They're unaccompanied minors," the attendant said, glancing at the girls as if they weren't even part of the conversation. "First class is for adults only. Company policy. But they're not unaccompanied," the nanny replied gently. "I'm traveling with them. I'm just seated in premium economy. Their father booked these seats specifically. And here's the airline's own approval form." She held out the paperwork. The attendant barely glanced at it. "Doesn't matter. I've never seen kids up front without a parent. It's not appropriate. Besides, what if they cause a disturbance? First-class passengers expect peace and quiet." Maya's smile had faded. She looked down at her shoes. Zoe, usually the bolder of the two, opened her mouth to speak, but the nanny gave her hand a soft squeeze, a silent signal to stay calm. "Ma'am," the nanny said, keeping her voice steady, "they're well-behaved, and they've flown before. Their father owns—" She stopped herself just in time. She'd been about to say something she knew the girl's father would never want used as leverage. He'd raised them to never throw his name around, to earn respect, not demand it. So she simply finished. "He made this arrangement with your customer service team weeks ago. There's even a note in your system." The flight attendant sighed as if this were an inconvenience she didn't have time for. "Look, I don't know what someone told you on the phone, but I'm in charge of cabin safety and order. And I'm telling you, those seats are being reassigned. The girls will sit in the back with you." She turned and spoke into her headset, then pointed down the jet bridge. "Go ahead and board. I'll have someone escort them to seats 28C and 28D. The girls exchanged a look. They didn't cry. They didn't argue. But their shoulders slumped and the spark in their eyes dimmed. This wasn't how their big adventure was supposed to start. As they walked down the narrow passage, Zoe whispered, "Why doesn't she believe us?" Maya didn't answer. She just tightened her grip on her sister's hand. Inside the plane, the contrast was impossible to ignore. The front of the cabin was quiet, spacious, with wide leather seats and soft lighting. Passengers there sipped sparkling water and read thick novels, barely glancing up. But as they moved further back, the space grew tighter. The noise louder. Crying babies, overhead bins slamming shut. the hum of anxious energy. Their new seats were near the rear galley, right across from the lavatories. The armrests were sticky, and someone had left a crumpled napkin on the tray table. Zoe wrinkled her nose. Maya stared out the window, her reflection showing a face that looked much older than 10. The nanny sat across the aisle, her heart heavy. She wanted to fix this, to march up front and demand justice, but she also knew that making a scene would only embarrass the girls more. So she gave them a reassuring smile and mouthed, "It's okay." But it wasn't okay, and deep down they all knew it. What made it worse wasn't just the downgrade, it was the way it had been done. Like their presence was a mistake. Like they didn't belong. Like their tickets, their father's careful planning. Their good behavior. None of it mattered because they were just two black girls in pretty dresses. Easy to dismiss. As the plane taxied down the runway, the twins buckled their seatbelts in silence. The engines roared and the ground fell away beneath them. Up in first class, passengers leaned back in comfort, sipping champagne. But in 28C and 28D, two sisters stared out at the clouds, wondering why kindness hadn't been enough. What neither the flight attendant nor anyone else at that gate knew was this. The man who'd signed those first-class tickets wasn't just any businessman. He was the founder and CEO of Skyward Airways, the very airline they were flying on. He'd built it from the ground up, turning a small regional carrier into one of the most respected names in the industry. And he'd done it not for fame, but because he believed air travel should feel human, respectful, fair and full of dignity for everyone, no matter their age, race, or seat assignment. He'd also taught his daughters to carry themselves with grace even when the world didn't show them any. So they didn't complain. They didn't pout. But that didn't mean they didn't notice, and someone else had noticed too. From a window seat in business class, a silver-haired man in a rumpled blazer watched the whole exchange. He'd recognized the girls instantly, not from tabloids or social media, but from a company holiday party years ago, where they'd shyly handed out handmade thank you cards to every employee. He'd been the airline's head of operations before retiring last year, and he knew their father well, knew his values, his humility, and how fiercely he protected his children's privacy. Now, seeing them shuffled to the back like afterthoughts, he felt a quiet anger simmer in his chest, not loud, not dramatic, but deep. He pulled out his phone and typed a quick message to a former colleague still on the executive team. "Your boss's daughters just got denied first class on Flight 217. Attendant said kids don't belong up front. You might want to look into this before Elijah finds out the hard way." He hit send, then leaned back, watching the clouds swirl outside. The flight had only just begun, but somewhere a ripple had already started. And in the world of airlines where reputation was everything, even the smallest ripple could become a wave. Meanwhile, in seat 28C, Maya reached into her backpack and pulled out a small notebook. On the first page she wrote in careful cursive, "Today someone thought we didn't deserve to sit where we paid to sit. But Dad always says your worth isn't decided by where you sit, it's decided by how you stand." She closed the book, took a deep breath, and looked over at her sister. Zoe gave her a small, brave smile, and just like that they chose to rise, long before the plane ever touched down. The flight settled into its rhythm somewhere over the Atlantic. Outside the window, endless layers of cloud stretched like soft cotton under a pale blue sky. Inside, the cabin hummed with the low drone of engines, the occasional clink of cutlery from first class, and the muffled cries of a tired toddler a few rows back. Most passengers had dozed off, earbuds in, blankets tucked around their shoulders. But not everyone. In seat 12A, the man with silver hair and tired eyes stayed wide awake. His name was Harold, though most people at Skyward Airways had just called him Mr. Langston for the better part of 2 decades. He'd spent 30 years shaping the airline's operations, hiring crews, designing training programs, even picking the shade of blue for the flight attendant uniforms. He'd retired 6 months ago, promising himself he'd finally take that trip to the Scottish Highlands, read all the history books gathering dust on his shelf, and stopped checking airline news every morning like it was still his responsibility. But old habits die hard. He'd been on his way to visit his daughter and newborn grandson in Edinburgh when he spotted the twins at the gate. At first he thought he was imagining things. Maybe they just looked alike. But then he saw the way they held themselves, calm, polite, The kind of quiet confidence that didn't come from privilege, but from being raised by someone who taught them their value, didn't depend on other people's approval. That was unmistakable. That was Elijah's doing. And then came the confrontation. He'd watched as the flight attendant, tall, stern, with a voice that cut through noise like a blade, blocked their path. He heard the clipped tone, the quick dismissal, the way she barely glanced at the paperwork. He saw the girls' faces fall not with tears but with something heavier, disappointment wrapped in confusion. They were too young to name it, but Harold knew it well. It was the look of someone realizing for the first time that the world doesn't always play fair, even when you do everything right. He didn't intervene, not because he didn't care, but because stepping in as the former executive would have made it about power, not principle. And Elijah had always believed that dignity shouldn't need a title to be honored. So instead, Harold did the one thing he could. He sent a message. Now, as the plane cruised at 35,000 feet, he kept his phone in his lap, waiting. He didn't expect a reply mid-flight. Airline execs weren't glued to their phones like teenagers. But he knew the message would land the moment the recipient touched down or checked in at headquarters. And when it did, things would move fast. Skyward wasn't some faceless corporation. It was built on a simple idea: treat people like people. If that idea was slipping, Elijah would want to know, and he'd want it fixed before it became a pattern. Meanwhile, in the back of the plane, the twins tried to make the best of it. The nanny had slipped them noise-canceling headphones and their favorite chocolate-covered almonds from home. Zoe was sketching a dragon in her notebook, tongue poking out in concentration. Maya was reading a book about space explorers, her finger tracing each line slowly. They weren't talking much, but they didn't need to. They had a language all their own. Glances, nudges, shared sighs. A flight attendant, different from the one at the gate, paused by their row. She was younger, with kind eyes and a warm smile. "Everything okay back here?" she asked softly. The nanny nodded. "Just fine, thank you," but the attendant lingered. She'd overheard the commotion during boarding. She'd seen the girls' first-class tags get torn off and replaced with economy ones. She hadn't said anything then, new on the crew, not wanting to rock the boat. But now, seeing how quietly they carried themselves, she felt a pang of guilt. "Would you like some extra pillows?" she offered. "Or maybe a warm drink? We've got hot chocolate." Maya looked up. "Do you have marshmallows?" The attendant grinned. "Two kinds," Zoe perked up. "With sprinkles?" "No sprinkles," the attendant laughed, "but I'll see what I can do." She walked away, already planning to sneak a few from the kids' meal kit, even if it wasn't technically allowed. Small kindnesses, she figured, cost nothing. Back in first class, the senior flight attendant, Diane, was reviewing the passenger manifest on her tablet. Everything seemed normal. A few VIPs, a couple of frequent flyers, nothing out of the ordinary. She prided herself on running a smooth cabin. No drama, no delays, no nonsense. She'd been with Skyward for 15 years and she knew the rules inside and out. Children in first class? Unheard of, especially without a parent. She'd done the right thing. Maintained standards. Protected the experience of paying customers. She didn't know that. One of those paying customers was the man who'd signed her paycheck for the last decade and a half. What she also didn't know was that her decision had already traveled farther than the plane itself. In a sleek office on the 28th floor of Skyward's headquarters in Chicago, a phone buzzed on a glass desk. It was just after 8 a.m. local time. The head of customer experience, a woman named Priya, who'd started as a gate agent 20 years ago, was sipping her second coffee when Harold's message popped up. She read it once. Then again, her stomach dropped. She pulled up Flight 217's passenger list, scrolled down. There it was. 2 child tickets in first class, booked under a private account linked directly to the CEO's office, accompanied by a nanny in premium economy, special handling notes. Treat with same care as if I were present. Priya's fingers flew across the keyboard. She pulled up the crew roster. Diane Carter, senior flight attendant, excellent record, but known for being rigid, by the book. Sometimes too much so. She picked up her desk phone. "Get me the chief purser on Flight 217. Patch him through the moment he's available." Then she typed a quick email to legal, HR, and the CEO's executive assistant. Potential service failure involving CEO's family on FL 217. Initiating protocol Echo 7. Stand by. Protocol Echo 7 was rarely used. It meant a situation that could damage trust at the highest level, not because of money but because of values. While all this unfolded on the ground, the plane continued its journey. Lunch was served. The twins got plastic-wrapped sandwiches and apple slices. Up front, passengers enjoyed seared salmon and wine pairings. No one connected the dots. No one except Harold, who now watched Diane move through the cabin with practiced efficiency, unaware that her career might be hanging by a thread. He felt no joy in that thought. He didn't want her fired. He wanted her to understand. Because the real issue wasn't the seat assignment. It was the assumption behind it. The quiet belief that certain people, children, people of color, those without a visible adult, didn't belong in spaces of comfort or respect unless they proved themselves. And that kind of thinking, if left unchecked, could rot an airline from the inside out. Hours passed. The sun dipped lower in the sky. The pilot announced they'd begin their descent into London soon. Flight attendants collected trays, stowed carts, and reminded passengers to fasten their seatbelts. Diane stood near the galley, double-checking that everything was secure. That's when her headset crackled. "Diane, this is Chief Purser Reynolds. I need you to step into the forward galley, now." Her brow furrowed. "Is everything okay?" "Just come." She walked forward, her shoes clicking softly on the carpet. Inside the small service area, Reynolds stood with his arms crossed, face unreadable. "What's going on?" she asked. He lowered his voice. "Did you reassign 2 child passengers from first class to economy during boarding in New York?" Diane stiffened. "Yes, they were unaccompanied minors. Against policy. Did you check the booking notes? Did you call customer service to verify?" "I didn't see the need. It was obvious." Reynolds exhaled slowly. "Those minors are the daughters of Elijah Thorne." The color drained from Diane's face. "What? You heard me. And he's flying back on this same aircraft tonight. From London to New York, he's already confirmed." Diane's hands went cold. I didn't know." "That's the problem," Reynolds said, not unkindly but firmly. "You didn't ask. You assumed. And now, instead of welcoming his children like honored guests, we've made them feel like intruders." He paused, letting it sink in. "HQ has been notified. They're handling it. But you need to be ready to speak with leadership as soon as we land. And Diane, don't go home tonight. Wait for instructions." She nodded, numb. The plane began its descent, but inside her chest the world felt like it was falling faster. Back in row 28, the twins were gathering their things. Zoe zipped her backpack carefully. Maya folded her blanket and placed it on the seat. They didn't know about the messages, the protocols, the panic unfolding behind the scenes. All they knew was that their trip hadn't started the way they'd hoped, but they were still going to see their grandmother. And that mattered more. As the wheels touched down at Heathrow, rain streaked the windows. The cabin lights brightened. Passengers stood stretching, reaching for bags. Harold stood too, slinging his coat over his shoulder. As he passed the twins' row, he gave them a small, knowing nod. Not intrusive, just seen. Maya looked up and smiled faintly. In that moment, she didn't know who he was, but she felt it. Someone had noticed. Someone had cared enough to say, "You belong." And sometimes that's all it takes to keep going. Outside London waited, gray, rainy, full of stories. The nanny gathered the girls' documents and led them off the plane. They walked through the jet bridge, through immigration, through baggage claim, where their grandmother stood waiting with open arms and tears in her eyes. No one mentioned the seats. No one needed to, but thousands of feet above, in the quiet hum of an emptying aircraft, a flight attendant stood alone in the galley, staring at her reflection in the metal cabinet door, wondering how she'd missed something so simple. That respect isn't earned by status, it's given by choice. And somewhere in Chicago, a team was already drafting a new training module, one that wouldn't just teach rules, but remind people why they existed in the first place. The flight was over, but the real journey, for everyone involved, had just begun. The rain in London had softened to a mist by the time the twins stepped into the arrivals hall, their grandmother wrapping them in a hug so tight it squeezed the last bit of airport tension right out of them. She didn't ask about the flight. She didn't need to. She could see it in the way Maya held her backpack a little too close. In the quiet way Zoe kept glancing over her shoulder, as if still expecting someone to tell her she wasn't allowed somewhere. But Grandma just kissed the tops of their heads, took their hands and said, "Let's go home. I made your favorite stew." Back on the plane, the cabin crew began their post-flight routine, wiping down trays, collecting forgotten items, checking seat pockets for stray boarding passes. Most passengers had already disembarked, chattering about layovers or taxis or how tired they were. But Diane stayed near the front, her uniform still crisp, her hands folded tightly in front of her. She hadn't moved much since the chief purser's warning. Her mind kept replaying the moment at the jet bridge, the girl's wide eyes, the nanny's calm voice, her own sharp tone cutting through it all like scissors through paper. She'd thought she was doing her job. Now she wasn't so sure. Her headset buzzed again. It was the operations team on the ground. "Diane, please report to the crew lounge after deplaning. Someone from corporate will meet you there." She swallowed. Understood. As she walked off the aircraft, rolling her small suitcase behind her, she passed a maintenance worker humming softly to himself. A ground agent waved at a colleague. Normal sounds, normal people. But everything felt different now, like she was seeing the world through a slightly warped window. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, in a quiet corner office on the top floor of Skyward Airways headquarters, a man sat alone in the dark. The city lights glittered below, but he wasn't looking at them. He was staring at a photo on his desk, two little girls in matching rain boots splashing in a puddle, their laughter frozen in time. His daughters. His heart. He'd just gotten off a call with his mother in London. She'd told him how the girls had run into her arms, how they'd been quiet at first, how they'd asked if it was okay to sit at the big table for dinner, even if we're just kids. That last part had hit him like a punch to the chest. He hadn't planned to fly back that night. He'd been working on a new sustainability initiative, something that would cut the airline's carbon footprint by 30% over 5 years. But now he changed his mind. He picked up the phone and called his assistant. "Book me on tonight's return flight. Same aircraft, first class." Then he added quietly, "And tell them I'll be flying as myself. No special treatment, just let the crew know I'm coming." He didn't say it out of anger. He said it because he believed in facing things head-on. If his own airline had failed his children, not with malice but with indifference, then he needed to understand how. And more importantly, he needed the person responsible to understand why it mattered. By early evening, London's Heathrow bustled again with departing passengers. The same aircraft that had brought the twins across the ocean was now being prepped for its return journey. Fresh linens, stocked galleys, polished windows. The crew for the outbound flight had been replaced except for one. Diane had been asked to stay on, not as punishment, the chief purser explained gently, but because the situation requires continuity. She'd nodded, too numb to argue. She stood near the gate now, checking her clipboard, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Her stomach twisted every time a passenger walked by. What if someone recognized her? What if they'd seen what happened? She kept replaying Priya's voice from the call she'd received after landing. "This isn't just about policy, Diane. It's about perception. It's about whether a 10-year-old girl feels welcome in a space she paid for. That's the soul of this airline." She'd never thought of it that way before. To her, the job had always been about safety, efficiency, order. But maybe she'd forgotten the human part, the part that made people choose Skyward over other carriers not because of the seats, but because of how they were treated. Boarding began. First-class passengers arrived, business people in tailored coats, a couple celebrating an anniversary, an elderly man traveling alone with a walking cane. Diane greeted each one politely, scanned their passes, directed them down the jet bridge. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly. Then she saw him. He wasn't dressed like a CEO. No suit, no tie. Just dark jeans, a soft-looking sweater, and a worn leather satchel slung over one shoulder. But she knew. She'd seen his photo in company newsletters, in training videos about Skyward's founding principles. It was him, Elijah Thorne. Her breath caught. He walked up to the gate, handed over his boarding pass without a word. She scanned it. Seat 1A. Of course it was. "Good evening, sir," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked at her, not with anger, not with accusation, just looked. His eyes were calm but deep, like a lake that had seen storms and still held its peace. "Evening," he said simply. Then he stepped onto the jet bridge. Diane stood frozen for a moment, her heart pounding. She wanted to say something. Apologize, explain, beg for understanding, but the words wouldn't come. And maybe that was for the best. Some things can't be fixed with a sentence. Inside the plane, Elijah took his seat. The first-class cabin was quiet, elegant, just as it always was. A flight attendant offered him a drink. He declined, thanked her, and leaned back, closing his eyes. But he wasn't sleeping. He was thinking. He remembered the early days of Skyward, how he'd started with one leased plane and a dream that flying shouldn't feel cold or corporate. He'd hired people not just for their resumes but for their kindness. He'd insisted on training that emphasized empathy over authority. And for years it had worked. Passengers wrote letters saying they'd felt seen, not just served. But organizations grow. Systems get complex, and sometimes the original spirit gets buried under layers of procedure. He opened his eyes and glanced toward the back of the plane, as if he could see through the curtain to where his daughters had sat just hours earlier. He wondered what they were doing now. If they were laughing with their grandmother. If they'd forgotten the whole thing, he hoped they had. But he knew better. The cabin doors closed. The engines powered up. As the plane taxied down the runway, Elijah watched the city lights blur into streaks of gold and white. He wasn't here to fire anyone. He was here to remind someone, and maybe himself, that rules without heart are just walls. Midway through the flight, after dinner had been served and most passengers had settled in with books or movies, Elijah unbuckled his seatbelt. He stood, stretched slightly, and walked toward the rear galley. Not in a hurry, not with drama, just like any passenger might. Diane was restocking tea bags when she saw him approaching. Her hands froze. She straightened up, smoothing her uniform. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" he asked, his voice low enough that only she could hear. She nodded, throat tight. He led her to a quiet spot near the emergency exit, away from other crew and passengers. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. He just looked at her, not as a CEO, but as a father. Then he spoke gently. "My girls didn't cry when they were moved. They didn't make a scene. But when they got to London, my mother told me they asked her a question. 'Grandma, do people think we don't belong in nice places because of how we look?'" Diane's eyes filled with tears. She looked down. I never meant." "I know," he said. "You didn't do it out of hate. You did it out of habit. And that's what worries me more." She finally met his gaze. "I thought I was following the rules." "Rules are tools," he said, "not replacements for judgment. You saw two black girls without a parent beside them, and you assumed they didn't belong up front. But what if they'd been white? What if they'd been with a nanny who looked more official? Would you have questioned it then?" She didn't answer. But the silence said everything. He sighed. "Skyward isn't just metal and fuel and schedules. It's trust. And when a child feels unwelcome on our plane, that trust breaks. Not just for them, for everyone who hears the story." He paused, then added, "I'm not going to fire you, but I'm going to ask you something. Next time, before you enforce a rule, ask yourself, am I protecting the airline, or am I protecting someone's dignity?" Diane swallowed hard. I don't know how to fix this." "Start by seeing people," he said. "Not categories. Not policies, people." He turned to go, then stopped. "And Diane, thank you for staying on this flight. That took courage." She watched him walk back to his seat, her vision blurred. For the first time in years, she felt not like an employee, but like a person who'd made a mistake and been given a chance to learn from it. Back in first class, Elijah settled in again. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt tired, but also hopeful. Because change doesn't always come from shouting. Sometimes it comes from a quiet conversation at 35,000 feet, where one person chooses understanding over punishment, and somewhere over the ocean, as the plane carried its passengers through the night, something shifted, not just in a policy manual, but in a human heart. The flight back to New York landed just after dawn. The sky streaked with soft pinks and grays as the plane rolled to a quiet stop at the gate. Most passengers were still half asleep, blinking under the cabin lights, gathering their things with the slow movements of people who'd crossed an ocean in the dark. But Elijah was already awake, his thoughts clear, his purpose steady. He didn't rush. He waited until the aisle cleared, then stood, slung his satchel over his shoulder, and walked off the aircraft like any other traveler. No entourage, no fanfare, just a man heading home after a long night. Diane lingered in the galley, finishing her final checklist. Her hands moved automatically, securing carts, logging supplies, but her mind was elsewhere. The conversation with Elijah replayed in her head, not as a scolding, but as a mirror. She kept hearing his words. Am I protecting the airline, or am I protecting someone's dignity? It wasn't a question she'd ever been trained to ask. In all her years, the focus had always been on compliance, on avoiding complaints, on keeping things smooth. But smooth for whom? That was the part she'd missed. As she stepped off the plane, the cool morning air hit her face like a reset button. She took a deep breath. A ground crew member nodded at her. Rough flight? She almost laughed. Not rough, just heavy. Back at crew headquarters, she was asked to report to a small conference room on the 3rd floor. No one was angry. No one shouted. Priya was there, along with the chief purser and a woman from HR who introduced herself as Lena. They offered Diane coffee. They didn't sit across from her like interrogators. They sat beside her at the same table. We're not here to punish you, Priya said gently. We're here to understand. And to make sure this doesn't happen again. Diane nodded, her voice quiet. I want that too. They talked for over an hour, not about blame, but about blind spots. About how even well-meaning people can carry assumptions they don't even know they have. Lena shared stories from other airlines where similar incidents had led to public outrage, lawsuits, lost trust. But Skyward, she said, had a chance to handle this differently, not as a crisis but as a turning point. By the end of the meeting, a decision had been made. Diane wouldn't be suspended. She wouldn't lose her job. Instead, she'd be invited to help design a new training module, one that didn't just list rules, but explored real human moments like the one at the gate. You were in it, Lena said. You know what it felt like. That's valuable. Diane wasn't sure she deserved that kind of trust, but she accepted it anyway because she knew it was the only way forward. Meanwhile, Elijah had gone straight home. Not to his office, not to a boardroom, but to his kitchen where he made pancakes the way his daughters liked them. Slightly crispy at the edges, with a swirl of honey instead of syrup. He sat at the table alone, the house quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. He missed them already, but he also felt a strange sense of calm. He hadn't lashed out. He hadn't used his power to crush someone. He'd used it to open a door. Later that morning, he called a company-wide leadership huddle, not via email, not through layers of assistance, but a live video call with every department head, from customer service to in-flight operations. He didn't mention his daughters by name. He didn't shame anyone. He simply said, "We had a moment this week where a child felt unwelcome on our aircraft. That shouldn't happen, not ever. And if it did, it means we've drifted from who we said we'd be." He announced a new initiative, Project Horizon, a full review of all customer-facing policies with a focus on inclusivity, empathy, and real-world judgment, not just textbook compliance. And he made one thing clear. Frontline staff wouldn't be punished for speaking up when something felt wrong. In fact, they'd be encouraged to. The response was immediate. Within hours, dozens of employees, gate agents, baggage handlers, flight attendants, sent messages sharing their own stories. Times they'd seen passengers treated unfairly, moments they'd wanted to intervene but didn't feel they could. It was like a dam had cracked and honesty was finally flowing through. One message stood out. It was from a young attendant who'd served the twins hot chocolate on the flight. She wrote, "I saw what happened. I didn't say anything then and I'm sorry. But I gave them extra marshmallows. Small thing, I know, but I hope it helped them feel seen." Elijah read it twice. Then he replied, "Thank you. That wasn't small. That was everything." Over the next few weeks, changes began to ripple through the airline. Training sessions were updated. Role-playing scenarios now included situations involving children, elderly travelers, people with disabilities, and families of all kinds, not as exceptions, but as normal parts of the passenger experience. Supervisors were reminded that policy should never override basic human decency. And Diane? She threw herself into the new training program. She met with psychologists, diversity consultants, even former passengers who'd felt overlooked. She shared her own story, not to excuse what she'd done, but to show how easy it is to slip into autopilot. "I thought I was being professional," she told a group of new hires during a session. But professionalism without kindness is just coldness in a uniform. The room was silent. Then someone clapped. Then another. Not out of pity, but respect. Back in London, the twins had settled into their grandmother's cozy house. They'd visited museums, baked scones, played in the garden. The flight felt like a distant memory, except for one thing. A week after they arrived, a thick envelope came in the mail. No return address, just their names written in neat handwriting. Inside were 2 handwritten letters. Maya's read. Dear Maya, I'm sorry your journey didn't start the way it should have. You deserve to be welcomed, not questioned. I hope you never doubt your right to be anywhere your ticket takes you. And I hope you keep reading, keep dreaming, and keep standing tall. Even when the world tries to shrink you. With respect. A friend at Skyward, Zoe, said, Dear Zoe, your dragon sketch is amazing. I saw it in your notebook. Never stop creating. And never let anyone make you feel like you don't belong in the front of the plane or anywhere else. You're worthy, just as you are. Warmly, someone who's learning too. Tucked behind the letters were 2 sleek black cards. Lifetime first-class passes. Valid on any Skyward flight anytime. No restrictions. The girls showed them to their grandmother, who smiled through tears. Your father didn't send these, she said softly. But he made sure they happened. When Elijah finally flew to London to bring them home, he didn't book first class. He booked 3 seats in economy right together. We'll sit where we want to sit, he told them, not because of the label, but because we're together. On the flight back, Maya leaned her head on his shoulder. Dad, she asked quietly, do you think that lady feels bad? I think she's trying to do better, he said. And that's what matters. Zoe, ever practical, added, do you think she likes marshmallows? He laughed. I hope so. Months passed. Skyward's new training program rolled out globally. Employee feedback was overwhelmingly positive. Passenger satisfaction scores and family travel segments rose for the first time in years. And Diane? She became a mentor for new crew members. Known not for her strictness, but for her warmth. One evening, she received an invitation, not to a disciplinary meeting, but to a small gathering at the Airline's annual Value Summit. The keynote speaker was Elijah. He didn't talk about profits or routes. He talked about moments, about how a single interaction, kind or unkind, can echo in someone's life longer than any in-flight meal or seat width ever could. After his talk, he spotted Diane in the crowd. He walked over. You're doing good work, he said. I'm trying, she replied. You're succeeding. They stood there for a moment, not as CEO and employee, but as 2 people who'd been changed by the same event, on opposite sides of it, but now walking in the same direction. Later that night, Diane went home and wrote in her journal for the first time in years. She wrote about shame, about learning, about the quiet power of being given a second chance. And at the bottom she wrote, Today I saw a little girl at the gate holding her mom's hand, looking nervous. I knelt down, smiled, and said, First time flying? You're going to love it. She smiled back. And just like that, I started making things right. Back in New York, the twins were back in school, their adventure now just a story they told their friends, carefully, without names, without bitterness. When asked what they learned, Maya said, that it's okay to be disappointed, but not okay to give up on people. So he added, and that marshmallows make everything better. Their father listened, proud not because they'd been in first class, but because they'd handled unfairness with grace and still believed in kindness. The airline kept flying. Planes took off and landed every hour, carrying millions of stories. But somewhere in all those journeys, one small moment had sparked something bigger. A reminder that service isn't about status. It's about seeing each other. Truly, and saying without words, you belong here. And in a world that often feels divided, that might be the most important destination of all. A year had passed since that morning at the gate, the one that started with 2 girls in matching dresses and ended with a quiet ripple moving through an entire airline. Spring had returned, and with it a sense of renewal that felt more than seasonal. At Skyward Airways headquarters, the walls no longer just displayed route maps and safety charts. Now there were framed quotes from passengers, photos of crew members volunteering in communities, and a small digital screen that rotated messages like, Today, someone felt seen. That's why we fly. Diane stood in front of a classroom of new flight attendants, not in a Navy uniform this time, but in a soft blazer and jeans. She wasn't giving a lecture. She was sharing a story, the kind that doesn't come from a manual but from real life with all its stumbles and second chances. "I used to think my job was to keep things running smoothly," she said, her voice calm but honest. "But smooth for who? That's the question I never asked until I got it wrong in the worst way." She told them about the twins, without names, without drama, just enough to show how a single assumption, made in seconds, can leave a mark that lasts far longer than a flight. She talked about the shame, the fear of losing everything, and then the surprise of being met not with punishment but with an invitation to help fix what was broken. One of the trainees raised a hand. "Did you ever see them again?" Diane smiled faintly. "Not in person, but I heard they're doing great. And every time I see a child boarding alone, I remember, it's not my job to judge their place. It's my job to make sure they feel like they belong." After class, a young woman approached her. "My little sister's flying solo next month," she said. "I was nervous about it. But after hearing you, I feel better." That, Diane realized, was the real reward. Not redemption, but connection. Meanwhile, across town, Elijah sat in his office, not behind a grand desk, but at a small table near the window. Spread out before him were sketches, dozens of them, sent in by kids from all over the world as part of Skyward's new Young Travelers program. The initiative had started small. Invite children who'd flown alone to share their experiences through art, stories, or letters. The response had been overwhelming. Some drawings showed smiling pilots, others showed clouds shaped like animals. One, from a boy in Nairobi, showed a plane with wings made of hands, holding each other up. He picked up a sketch from London. Two girls side by side, wearing sky blue dresses, standing in front of a plane with a rainbow trailing behind it. At the bottom, in careful handwriting, "Thank you for letting us fly like we mattered." He folded it gently and placed it in a folder labeled, "Why We Do This." It wasn't for show. It was for days when the weight of running a company made him forget the human heart at the center of it all. Later that week, Skyward held its first annual Dignity and Service Symposium, a gathering not just for employees, but for passengers, community leaders, and even former critics. The keynote wasn't given by a CEO or a celebrity. It was delivered by a retired schoolteacher who'd once been denied a wheelchair assist because she didn't look disabled enough. Her talk wasn't angry. It was full of grace and a simple plea: see me, not my label. Me. Diane sat in the front row listening, taking notes. Afterward, she approached the woman and introduced herself. "I'm the one who moved those girls," she said quietly. "I'm trying to do better." The woman studied her for a moment, then reached out and squeezed her hand. "Then you already are." Back in London, the twins were older now, 11 going on 12, and full of opinions, dreams, and questions about the world. They'd just returned from a school trip to the Science Museum, buzzing about space travel and ocean conservation. That evening, over dinner with their grandmother, Maya pulled out a letter she'd been working on. "I'm writing to Skyward," she said, "not to complain, to thank them." Zoe looked up from her mashed potatoes. "For what?" "For listening. For changing. For not pretending it didn't happen." Their grandmother smiled. "That's very kind of you." "It's not just kind," Maya replied. "It's important. If people never say thank you when someone fixes a mistake, they might stop trying." A few days later, the letter arrived at Skyward's customer care office. It was handwritten on pale blue stationery, sealed with the sticker of a rocket ship. Inside, Maya had written, "Dear Skyward team, my sister and I flew with you last year. Things didn't start well, but they ended with us feeling respected. That taught us something. People can mess up and still choose to do better. That's a lesson we'll carry forever. P.S. Zoe says your hot chocolate is still the best. Please keep the marshmallows." The letter made its way to Elijah's desk. He read it 3 times. Then he called a meeting. "We're doing something new," he announced to his leadership team. "Starting next month, every employee who completes the empathy training will receive a copy of this letter. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder." He paused. Because real change isn't measured in policy updates. It's measured in moments where someone feels safe, seen, and worthy, just as they are. As summer approached, Skyward rolled out its most ambitious update yet, a compass pass for young solo travelers. It wasn't just about seating or snacks. It included a pre-flight video call with the crew, a personalized welcome note, and a small travel journal where kids could record their journey. Most importantly, every child was greeted by name at the gate. No assumptions, no delays, just a warm, "We've been expecting you." The program was inspired by two girls in blue dresses, but it was built for every child who'd ever been made to feel like an inconvenience. One warm June morning, Diane stood at a gate in Chicago, watching a 10-year-old boy approach with his grandmother. He clutched a stuffed owl and looked nervous. She knelt down, just like she'd practiced in training, and smiled. "Hi there. I'm Diane. I'll be on your flight today. And I hear you're heading to see your dad in Seattle?" The boy nodded, eyes wide. "Well," she said, handing him a small envelope, "he sent you a note, and I've got your favorite snack waiting up front, peanut-free, just like you asked." His face lit up. "You knew?" "We listen," she said softly. "Always." As he walked onto the jet bridge, hand in hand with a crew member assigned just to him, Diane felt something shift inside her. Not pride exactly, but peace. She wasn't the same person she'd been a year ago, and that was okay. That same week, Elijah took his daughters on a weekend trip, not for business, just for fun. They flew coach, sat together, shared headphones, and argued good-naturedly over the last bag of pretzels. No special treatment. No upgrades. Just three people side by side watching clouds drift past the window. At one point, Zoe turned to him and asked, "Do you think airlines will ever be perfect?" He thought for a moment. "No, people aren't perfect. But we can choose to keep trying. That's what matters." Maya looked out at the sky. "I think kindness is like gravity," she said. "You can't always see it, but it holds everything together." He didn't say anything. He just reached over and squeezed her hand. Back on the ground, life went on. Planes kept flying. Mistakes still happened because humans are human. But now when they did, there was a system not just to correct them but to learn from them. Crew members were encouraged to speak up. Passengers were treated as individuals, not categories. And somewhere in the middle of it all, a quiet culture shift had taken root. Service wasn't about control. It was about care. Months later, during a routine flight, a young attendant noticed an elderly woman struggling to lift her bag into the overhead bin. Instead of saying, "Sir, you'll need to check that," she simply smiled and said, "Let me help you with that, ma'am." The woman's eyes filled with tears. "No one's offered to help in so long," she whispered. That moment wasn't reported. It wasn't celebrated in a newsletter. But it mattered. And it wouldn't have happened without the chain of events set in motion by two girls who were told they didn't belong, and the people who chose to prove otherwise. In the end, the story wasn't really about first class or economy. It wasn't about who owned the airline or who made a mistake. It was about what happens when we choose to see each other, not as roles, not as risks, but as people deserving of dignity, no matter their age, their skin, or their seat assignment. And that, more than any frequent flyer mile or luxury amenity, is what makes a journey truly first class.